The night he called her his charity project was the night she stopped trying to be his wife. Manhattan glittered beneath the glass walls of the penthouse ballroom, yellow cabs threading through the streets 40 floors below like veins of light, the Hudson reflecting a thin blade of winter moon, and inside the room crystal chandeliers spilled gold across polished marble, while a string quartet played something soft and forgettable in the corner. Jonathan Hale stood near the center of it all, 6'2" in a tailored black tuxedo, silver hair at his temples catching the light just enough to suggest distinction, not age. One hand wrapped around a tumbler of sparkling water, the other resting lightly at the small of his wife's back, as if she were an accessory he had chosen for the evening. Imani Brooks Hale wore a midnight blue gown that skimmed her frame without clinging, long sleeves, high neckline, elegant and restrained, her natural curls swept back from her face, her skin glowing warm against the cool tones of the room, and for a moment she almost felt steady under the weight of so many watching eyes. One of Jonathan's investors laughed too loudly at something he said, and Jonathan leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to make the table lean closer, just enough to make her feel the shift before it came. "You know," he said with a thin smile, tapping the rim of his glass, "when I met Imani, she had big dreams. Modeling, acting, all that. I told her I'd take care of the bills so she wouldn't have to embarrass herself chasing cameras." The table chuckled. He paused, enjoying the rhythm of attention. "Now she just lets me fund her wardrobe and show up looking grateful. My little charity project." The laughter was softer this time, uncertain but compliant, the kind of laughter that belongs to people who depend on the man telling the joke. Imani felt the sound move through her like a draft under a door, cold and invisible. She kept her shoulders square. She kept her chin level. She even smiled, because that was what she had learned to do. From across the room, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like a painting, and she caught her reflection layered over the city, her face superimposed against steel and glass, and she wondered when she had started to look like someone waiting to be approved. It hadn't happened all at once. It had been a collection of small corrections. "That dress is a little loud. Maybe wear your hair straighter for the board dinner. You don't need to talk so much about your ideas. Let me handle the business conversations." Years of suggestions that felt like guidance until they felt like erasure. Jonathan liked to tell people he rescued her from instability. He liked the narrative of the powerful white entrepreneur who gave the talented but unfocused black girl a stable life. He never mentioned that when they met at a charity art gala in Chicago, she had been the one with the sharper questions, the one who challenged his presentation on community investment, the one who had a modeling portfolio already booked with regional campaigns. He liked to edit the origin story until he was the architect and she was the beneficiary. At the far end of the ballroom, a photographer lifted a camera to capture the Hale Foundation logo projected in white light against the wall. The flash burst once, then again, and for a second Imani's eyes closed against the brightness. She remembered another kind of light, the harsh white bulbs of a college auditorium runway in Atlanta, the way her heels had clicked steady and sure against plywood, the way the crowd had leaned forward not because of who she was married to, but because of how she walked. Back then she had measured her worth in the strength of her stride, not in the square footage of the apartment she lived in. "Smile, babe," Jonathan murmured under his breath as another investor approached, his hand tightening just slightly at her waist. "You look intense." Intense. That was the word he used when she didn't soften herself enough. She adjusted her mouth into something gentler, something smaller. "Of course," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. The investor's wife, a woman in her early 50s with careful highlights and diamond studs, tilted her head. "You're so lucky," she said to Imani. "Jonathan works so hard. Not every man would provide like that." Imani met her eyes and nodded. "I know," she said, and the truth in her tone surprised even her. She didn't know. She knew he worked 70-hour weeks. She knew he could close a deal before breakfast. She knew he had built Hale Ventures, from a shared co-working desk to a billion-dollar valuation in under 10 years. But she also knew how easily he dismissed the parts of her that didn't fit into his narrative of control. Later, when the quartet took a break and the hum of conversation swelled into a louder, looser rhythm, Jonathan gathered a smaller circle of guests near the balcony doors. The air outside pressed cold against the glass, and the city lights flickered as if reacting to his voice. I tell young founders all the time, he said, gesturing lightly. Choose partners who understand their role. Ambition is great, but not everyone is built for the spotlight. His gaze flicked toward Imani, just long enough for the meaning to land. Some people shine better supporting someone else's vision. A few nods. A few murmured agreements. Imani felt something inside her settle, not shatter, not explode, just settle into a stillness that was deeper than anger. She excused herself quietly and stepped away from the group, moving past clusters of tailored suits and shimmering gowns until she reached the hallway leading toward the private restrooms. The music faded behind her, replaced by the muted echo of her own heels against marble. In the mirror above the sink, she studied her reflection under cooler, flatter light. No skyline, no chandelier glow, just her face. High cheekbones, steady brown eyes, skin the color of rich earth. My charity project, she repeated softly, tasting the phrase as if it belonged to someone else. She had given up runway auditions when Jonathan's calendar became more demanding. She had stopped reaching out to agencies when he suggested it looked desperate for a married woman to still be chasing that kind of attention. She had told herself it was maturity, compromise, growth. But standing there alone, she recognized the pattern for what it was. Shrink, soften, step back, make space for him to expand. When she returned to the ballroom, Jonathan was mid-story again, describing a recent acquisition with confident precision, the men around him leaning in as if proximity might transfer some of his certainty. He caught her eye briefly and smiled, satisfied, as if the interruption had been handled, as if she had been handled. The rest of the evening blurred into polite goodbyes and elevator rides and the quiet hum of their black SUV navigating downtown traffic. From the back seat, Imani watched the city pass in streaks of light, Times Square billboards towering above the streets, faces 20 feet tall smiling down at crowds who never questioned whether they deserved to be seen. Jonathan scrolled through emails beside her, blue light reflecting off his glasses. Great turnout tonight, he said without looking up. You did fine. Fine. She nodded once. Outside, a massive digital screen shifted from a luxury watch advertisement to a cosmetics campaign, a model with deep brown skin staring straight ahead, unapologetic, powerful. The car moved on before Imani could read the brand name, but the image stayed with her, bright and impossible to ignore. That night, as she stood in the quiet of their penthouse bedroom, city lights leaking through the curtains in thin silver lines, she didn't cry. She didn't rehearse arguments in her head. She simply opened her closet and ran her fingers along the fabrics Jonathan had chosen, the silhouettes he preferred, the colors he approved. Somewhere between silk and satin, she felt the faint outline of a woman she used to be, not erased, just buried under years of careful compliance. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a different kind of light, one that didn't belong to his foundation or his investors or his last name, but to her, steady and unfiltered, waiting for the moment she would decide to step back into it. The next morning the city looked different, not because Manhattan had changed, but because Imani had. Pale winter sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, turning the glass towers across the avenue into mirrors of white fire. And she stood alone in the kitchen before anyone else was awake, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. Jonathan had left early for a breakfast meeting in Midtown, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne and a calendar reminder on the kitchen island written in his neat block handwriting about an investor call at 9. The apartment was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of traffic 40 floors below. She walked to the window and pressed her palm lightly against the glass. The cold steadied her. In the reflection, she saw the same woman from the ballroom, but something behind her eyes had shifted. It was not anger. It was clarity. She moved back toward the bedroom and opened her closet again, this time not to run her fingers along what Jonathan preferred, but to search for something he had forgotten. At the very back, tucked behind structured jackets and neutral dresses, she found a flat black portfolio case. Dust clung lightly to the zipper. She carried it to the bed and sat down, easing it open as if she were handling something fragile. Inside were photographs from nearly a decade ago. Glossy prints. Full color. Imani at 21, walking in a student showcase in Atlanta, shoulders back, chin lifted, eyes forward. Imani leaning against a brick wall in Chicago, sunlight catching the gold flecks in her skin. Imani laughing mid-shot, not posed, not filtered, just alive. She traced the outline of her younger self with one finger. Jonathan had once called these pictures adorable. He had said they were sweet evidence of a phase she would outgrow. She closed the portfolio slowly and looked around the bedroom. King-sized bed, Italian nightstands, abstract art chosen by a consultant, every object curated, every surface controlled. She stood and walked to the bathroom mirror, studying her face in the brighter morning light. There were faint lines near her eyes now, not from age but from restraint, from holding back reactions that would have complicated his version of peace. She inhaled deeply and made a decision that felt almost ordinary in its simplicity. She picked up her phone and searched for open casting calls in New York City. The screen filled with agency names, submission guidelines, requirements listed in precise bullet points. Height minimum 5'8". Portfolio required. Experience preferred. She was 5'9". She still had a portfolio. Experience was something she had once lived in like oxygen. Her finger hovered over the contact form for a boutique agency in Soho known for representing diverse talent. She hesitated only a second before attaching 3 of her older images and pressing send. The email whooshed away into the invisible web of servers and possibilities. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from recognition. Later that afternoon, she rode the subway downtown alone. No driver. No tinted windows. The train car smelled faintly of metal and coffee, and she stood holding a pole as it rattled beneath the East River. No one recognized her. No one looked twice. It felt honest. She exited onto Spring Street and walked toward a narrow building with a discreet silver plaque by the door. Inside, the reception area was small but bright. White walls covered in framed magazine covers featuring women of every shade and shape. A young assistant looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked. Imani offered a calm smile. "I submitted photos this morning. My name is Imani Brooks." The assistant typed quickly, then glanced at her screen. "Yes, we received them. Ms. Alvarez has about 10 minutes before her next meeting. You can wait." Imani sat in a minimalist chair, hands folded loosely in her lap, listening to the soft clicking of heels on concrete floors behind a glass door. When the door opened, a woman in her 40s with cropped dark hair and sharp eyes stepped out. "Imani?" she asked. Imani stood. "Yes." Ms. Alvarez studied her with a gaze that felt direct but not diminishing. "Come in." The office was simple. A desk, 2 chairs, a large window overlooking a brick courtyard. Ms. Alvarez sat and gestured for Imani to do the same. "Your bone structure is exceptional," she said without preamble. "Why did you stop modeling?" The question landed gently but firmly. Imani chose her words with care. "Life shifted. I allowed it to." Ms. Alvarez nodded as if she understood more than was spoken. "You have presence. That does not disappear with time. But this industry is not sentimental. You will need new images. Recent work. Are you prepared for that?" Imani met her eyes steadily. "Yes." There was no tremor in her voice. Ms. Alvarez leaned back slightly. "We have an open call next Thursday for an independent designer showing at New York Fashion Week. It is not a guarantee, but it is a door. A door." Imani felt the word settle into her chest like a promise. "I will be there," she said. When she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the city felt louder, sharper, more immediate. She checked her phone. No new messages from Jonathan. No missed calls. For a brief moment she imagined telling him about the meeting, about the open call, about the word door. She imagined his polite smile, the slight tilt of his head, the measured caution in his tone as he explained the risks of distraction. She imagined shrinking again to make his argument comfortable. The thought dissolved quickly. That evening Jonathan returned home later than usual, loosening his tie as he entered the kitchen. "You were out today," he said casually, glancing at her as she chopped vegetables for dinner. "The driver mentioned you did not need him." "I took the subway," she replied evenly. He paused for half a second, surprised. "The subway," he repeated as if testing the word. "That is unnecessary." "It was efficient," she said. He shrugged and reached for a glass. "Suit yourself. Just be careful. People recognize me. They might recognize you." She met his gaze without hostility. No one did. The truth hung between them, simple and unadorned. He nodded once, distracted, already moving on to an email flashing across his phone screen. After dinner, while Jonathan retreated to his office to review projections, Imani stood on the balcony alone. The wind cut sharp across the open air, tugging at her hair, carrying the layered sounds of sirens and laughter and distant music from the streets below. Across the skyline, billboards glowed against the night, rotating through advertisements every few seconds. She imagined her own face up there, not as someone's wife, not as an extension of a foundation, but as a woman defined by her own name. She did not know if it would happen. She did not know how many rejections waited between her and that possibility. But she knew the feeling rising inside her was not fragile. It was steady. It was earned. Inside, Jonathan laughed at something through the thin wall of his office, confident, secure in the architecture of his life. Outside, Imani lifted her chin toward the wind and allowed herself to stand fully in it, no longer bracing, no longer softening, already stepping toward a future that did not require his permission. Thursday arrived with a sky the color of brushed steel and a wind sharp enough to cut through wool, and Imani stood in front of her closet before sunrise, not searching for Jonathan's approval this time, but for balance, something that spoke without shouting. She chose black tailored trousers, a simple white fitted top, and a long camel coat that fell cleanly to her knees, strong lines, no excess, her hair pulled back into a low twist that revealed the architecture of her face. In the kitchen, the espresso machine hummed as Jonathan skimmed financial headlines on his tablet. He glanced up briefly. "Big plans today?" he asked, casual but curious. She poured her coffee slowly. "An appointment downtown." He nodded, distracted. "Do not forget the donor dinner next week. I want you seated next to the Langfords. They like you." The statement lingered in the air like a subtle reminder of her assigned role. "I will remember," she said, her voice even. She did not elaborate. She did not explain. An hour later she stepped out onto the street in Soho, the sidewalks already alive with delivery trucks, dog walkers, and early shoppers, the city moving at its relentless, practical pace. The open call was held in a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and tall industrial windows that let in a flood of pale morning light. Inside, nearly 30 women stood in a loose line along the wall, heels in hand, portfolios clutched to their chests, faces composed in careful neutrality. They were young, some barely out of high school, others with sharper, more seasoned expressions. A few glanced at Imani, assessing, curious. She felt the difference in age like a quiet echo, not a disadvantage but a distinction. She signed her name on a clipboard and pinned a small white card with the number 17 to the waistband of her trousers. 17. It felt symbolic without trying to be. At the far end of the room, a long table held 3 judges, including Ms. Alvarez, who gave her a brief nod of recognition. The designer, a tall man with round glasses and a soft voice, flipped through a stack of lookboards while assistants adjusted a portable speaker system. "We are looking for presence," he announced. "Not just beauty. Presence. Someone who understands the garment before the garment understands them." The words landed squarely in Imani's chest. One by one, the women were called forward. Each removed her coat, slipped on borrowed sample heels, and walked the length of taped lines on the concrete floor. Some moved with practiced fluidity, others with visible nerves. When number 17 was called, the room seemed to inhale slightly. Imani stepped forward, unbuttoned her coat, and handed it to an assistant. The concrete felt cool beneath the thin soles of the heels provided to her, nearly 4 inches high, familiar but not forgiving. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, hearing in memory the echo of a college runway, the rhythm of her own breath, the way she once trusted her body without commentary. Then she began. Her stride was steady, not rushed, hips aligned, shoulders relaxed but deliberate, gaze fixed just above the heads of the judges, as if she were already seeing beyond them. The space between each step carried intention. She reached the end of the line, pivoted smoothly, and returned with the same measured confidence, not performing youth, not apologizing for experience. When she stopped in front of the table, there was no tremor in her stance. The designer leaned back slightly, studying her. "How old are you?" he asked, not unkindly. 32, she answered. A few eyebrows lifted at the table. "You have walked before," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she replied. I stopped. "I am walking again." A faint smile touched the corner of Ms. Alvarez's mouth. "Thank you," the designer said, making a note on his pad. Imani stepped back into line, coat draped over her arm, heart beating but not racing. She did not know if she had secured anything. She only knew she had shown up fully. After the final model walked, the room buzzed with quiet speculation. Assistants gathered numbers and whispered between themselves. 17, 23, and 9. One of them called out at last, "Please stay." The rest were dismissed with polite gratitude. The sound of heels and footsteps receded toward the door. Imani remained standing, number 17 still pinned at her waist. The designer approached the 3 selected women. "We have one look available for the show," he said. "A closing piece. Structured. Powerful. We need someone who can carry it without being swallowed by it." He looked at each of them in turn. When his eyes settled on Imani, something shifted in his expression from curiosity to decision. 17, he said. "We would like you to return tomorrow for fitting." The words were simple. The impact was not. Imani felt the air change around her, not dramatically, but undeniably. She nodded once. "Thank you." Outside, the city seemed louder than before, horns sharper, footsteps faster, as if the entire grid of streets had tilted slightly in her favor. She checked her phone. 2 missed calls from Jonathan. A text message followed. "Call me when you see this." She paused on the sidewalk before responding. When she returned his call, his voice carried a tight edge beneath its calm surface. "Where are you?" he asked. "Downtown," she answered. "Why?" "I had lunch with one of the Langfords. He mentioned seeing you enter some kind of casting space this morning. Care to explain?" The question was not angry. It was measured, controlled. "I went to an open call," she said plainly. Silence stretched on the line for a few seconds. "For modeling?" he asked, as if confirming a rumor. "Yes." Another pause. "Imani," he began, his tone shifting into something closer to reason than reproach. "You do not need that world anymore. It is unstable. It is exhausting. We have built something solid. Why revisit a phase you outgrew?" She watched a group of tourists cross the street in front of her, bundled in scarves, unaware of the negotiation unfolding above their heads. "It was not a phase," she said quietly. "It was a part of me." He exhaled slowly. "And what happens if this becomes public? Investors talk. The media connects dots. It complicates our image." There it was. Not her well-being. Not her fulfillment. Image. "I am not asking for permission," she replied, her voice steady but not raised. The silence that followed felt different from the others. Less controlled. "Be careful," he said at last. "That industry does not protect people." "I can protect myself," she answered. She ended the call gently, not with anger, but with finality. As she resumed walking, the reflection of a towering digital billboard flickered across a storefront window. For a brief second she imagined her own face up there, not as an accessory to a billionaire, not as a supporting character in someone else's empire, but as a woman who chose to return to her own light even when it unsettled the architecture around her. The wind tugged at her coat, and she let it, her posture upright, her steps aligned with a future that was no longer theoretical but unfolding in real time. The fitting took place the following afternoon in a loft studio in the garment district, where long tables were covered in spools of thread, fabric swatches, and half-finished silhouettes pinned onto dress forms like paused thoughts. Sunlight filtered through tall windows streaked with the faint haze of winter dust, catching on metal racks filled with structured coats and sharply tailored dresses. Imani stepped inside with measured calm, her portfolio tucked under her arm though no one had asked for it this time. An assistant greeted her and led her toward a raised platform surrounded by mirrors. The designer stood nearby holding a garment bag, as if it contained something fragile and deliberate. "You are on time," he said, a hint of approval in his tone. "That matters." She nodded once. "It always has." He unzipped the garment bag slowly, revealing a gown unlike anything she had worn before. It was not soft or flowing. It was architectural. Deep charcoal with subtle metallic threading that caught the light only when it moved, high neckline, long sleeves, the waist structured with clean, commanding lines, the skirt falling in a controlled cascade that suggested power rather than delicacy. "This closes the show," he said quietly. "It is not about youth. It is about authority." The words settled between them. Authority. An assistant helped her step into the gown, careful hands adjusting seams, smoothing fabric along her shoulders, fastening hidden closures along her back. The weight of the garment grounded her, reminding her of armor without aggression, strength without noise. She turned toward the mirror and for a moment did not recognize the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, but because she looked undeniable. The cut of the gown emphasized her height, her posture, the natural strength in her frame. There was no apology in its design. "Walk," the designer instructed softly. The platform beneath her feet felt solid as she began to move, the hem of the gown whispering against the wood with each step. The mirrors multiplied her image, reflecting her from every angle, not fragmenting her, but amplifying her. She pivoted at the end of the platform, the metallic threads catching the afternoon light in a restrained shimmer. The designer watched without blinking. When she finished, he exhaled slowly. "Yes," he said simply. "This is what I meant." Across town, Jonathan sat in his glass-enclosed office overlooking Bryant Park, the skyline crisp behind him, a wall of digital screens glowing with market updates and projected growth curves. He was mid-discussion with two senior partners when his phone vibrated discreetly on the table. He ignored it once, then again. On the third vibration, he glanced down, irritation flickering across his face. A message from a media analyst he occasionally consulted read, "Interesting development. That is your wife, correct?" Attached was a grainy but recognizable image pulled from an independent fashion blog's social media feed. Imani stood on a fitting platform in a charcoal gown, head lifted, posture commanding, the caption reading, "New face to watch at Fashion Week fitting today." The partners continued speaking, unaware of the shift happening at the head of the table. Jonathan stared at the screen a fraction longer than necessary. "Excuse me," he said evenly, standing from his chair. He stepped into the hallway, glass door closing softly behind him. He enlarged the image with his fingers, studying the details. The gown, the lighting, the expression on her face. It was not tentative. It was not playful. It was resolute. He felt something unfamiliar press against his composure. Not anger. Not pride. Displacement. He dialed her number. Back in the studio, Imani stood as a stylist adjusted the fall of the skirt one final time. Her phone buzzed in her bag. She did not reach for it immediately. When it buzzed again, she stepped aside and answered. "Hello. I saw the photo," Jonathan said without preamble. His voice was calm, but the edges were sharper now. "It is circulating." She looked at her reflection once more before responding. "It is a fitting. It is visibility," he corrected. "You did not mention a show. You did not ask." Silence moved through the line. "Imani," he began carefully. "You know how quickly narratives form. Investors read between lines that do not exist. I need to understand what you are trying to prove." She held the phone steady against her ear. "I am not proving anything," she said. "I am returning to something." In his office hallway, Jonathan paced once, then stopped, staring at the city beyond the glass. "And what happens if this overshadows our foundation event next week? The press will connect your appearance to my portfolio. They will question focus." There it was again. Focus. Image. Alignment. She let the words pass through her without absorbing them. "Then let them," she replied softly. "The work will still speak for itself." He exhaled audibly. "You are changing the equation." "No," she said. "I am correcting it." The line went quiet for several seconds, the distance between Midtown and the garment district feeling larger than the few miles that separated them. "Be ready for attention," he said at last. "It does not always come kindly." "I am not afraid of being seen," she answered. She ended the call before he could respond. The stylist approached again, offering a pair of minimalist heels to complete the look. "We will rehearse once more," she said gently. Imani stepped back onto the platform, the gown settling around her like certainty. This time when she walked, she imagined the length of a true runway, the heat of stage lights, the low hum of a crowd waiting for something unexpected. She did not imagine Jonathan watching. She imagined herself arriving. As she moved, assistants paused to observe, their chatter softening into focus. There was no dramatic music, no applause, only the quiet recognition that something aligned. When she reached the end of the platform and turned, the mirrors caught her from every angle, multiplying the image of a woman who had once been introduced as an accessory and was now standing as the final statement of an entire collection. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped lower over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the streets. In his office, Jonathan stood still, phone lowered at his side, the image of her in that gown lingering on his screen long after he locked it. For the first time in years, he was not directing the narrative. Somewhere between the glass towers and the narrow studio loft, the balance had shifted, not with noise or spectacle, but with a woman stepping back into her own light and refusing to dim it again. The night of the show arrived wrapped in electric anticipation, the kind that hummed through the streets of Manhattan long before the first spotlight turned on. Bryant Park was lined with black SUVs and clusters of photographers, their camera lenses catching every flicker of movement beneath the white tents erected for Fashion Week. Inside the main pavilion, rows of sleek chairs formed a perfect corridor down the center runway, polished to a reflective sheen that mirrored the overhead lights like a river of glass. Backstage, the air was thick with the scent of hairspray and warm fabric, stylists moving with fast, precise hands, makeup artists brushing luminous tones across cheekbones, assistants calling out names over the steady rhythm of heels clicking against concrete. Imani stood near a rack labeled Closing Look, her charcoal gown suspended beside her like a quiet promise. The designer approached with calm intensity. "Remember," he said softly, adjusting the collar once more, "this is not about decoration. It is about declaration." She nodded. Her heartbeat was steady, not frantic. She had expected nerves, but what filled her instead was something deeper, something anchored. Across town, Jonathan sat in the front row of the pavilion, invited by a strategic sponsor who had no idea how personal the evening would become. He wore a tailored navy suit, posture composed, hands resting lightly on his knees as he surveyed the room. Executives, editors, celebrities, and investors filled the surrounding seats, their conversations low but charged. A few recognized him and offered polite greetings. He responded with measured warmth, but his attention drifted repeatedly to the runway entrance draped in black velvet curtains. The show began with a slow crescendo of instrumental music, deep strings vibrating through the floor. Model after model emerged beneath the lights, silhouettes sharp, fabric structured, the audience murmuring approval. Jonathan watched with professional detachment at first, nodding at clever cuts and innovative tailoring. But as the show progressed, an undercurrent of anticipation built in the air. Backstage, Imani closed her eyes for a brief moment as an assistant secured the final clasp at the back of her gown. The metallic threads shimmered subtly under the backstage bulbs. 30 seconds, someone called. The first note of a deeper, more resonant score filled the pavilion, signaling the closing look. The curtain parted. She stepped forward. The runway lights struck her instantly, bright and unapologetic, illuminating the lines of the gown and the unwavering lift of her chin. For a heartbeat, the audience stilled. Jonathan felt it before he fully saw her, a shift in energy that commanded attention. When his eyes locked onto the figure walking toward him, recognition did not come as surprise, but as impact. Imani moved with deliberate authority, each step measured, each pivot controlled, the structured gown amplifying her presence rather than containing it. The metallic threads caught the overhead lights in restrained flashes, like quiet lightning beneath storm clouds. She did not search the crowd. She did not soften her gaze. She walked as if the space belonged to her. Around Jonathan, whispers rippled. "Who is she?" someone murmured behind him. "That is Hale's wife," another voice answered, hushed but curious. The music deepened as she reached the midpoint of the runway, the hem of her gown gliding smoothly behind her. She paused at the end, shoulders squared, eyes steady, then turned with fluid precision, giving the audience one final, commanding angle before returning toward the curtain. In the front row, Jonathan remained still, but something within him recalibrated. He had once introduced her as a beneficiary of his stability. Now, beneath the relentless glow of stage lights, she was not attached to his name. She was carrying the final word of an entire collection. The applause began slowly, then swelled into something fuller, richer. Editors leaned forward to capture images. Phones lifted discreetly. The designer stepped onto the runway to join her for the closing bow, gesturing toward her with unmistakable pride. She inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, not deferential but composed. As the curtain closed behind her, the sound of applause continued to echo through the pavilion. Backstage erupted into relieved laughter and quick congratulations. Assistants embraced. The designer clasped her hands between his. "You understood it," he said simply. "You understood the power." She exhaled slowly, the adrenaline settling into something like clarity. A public relations coordinator approached with a tablet already buzzing with notifications. "The images are everywhere," she said, eyes wide. "Major accounts are reposting. Editors want interviews." Imani accepted the information with calm acceptance. She had imagined attention. She had prepared for scrutiny. What she had not prepared for was the quiet satisfaction that came from earning it on her own terms. Outside the pavilion, Jonathan stood near the exit as guests filtered into the cool night air, conversations animated, speculation alive. A fellow investor approached him with a raised brow. "Quite the surprise," the man said lightly. "You have been holding out on us." Jonathan managed a controlled smile. "Imani has always had talent," he replied, his tone even but thoughtful. The statement felt different now, less like ownership and more like acknowledgement. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, the city lights reflected off passing cars, and a massive digital billboard across the avenue flickered to life with a looping image from the show. Imani's silhouette filled the screen, head lifted, metallic threads catching the light in a continuous, luminous sweep. Pedestrians paused to glance upward. Jonathan followed their gaze. For years he had curated visibility like an asset, controlling angles, narratives, exposure. Now, standing beneath a 20-foot image of the woman he had once diminished. In private jokes, he felt the architecture of control loosen. She had not asked for his validation. She had not sought his protection. She had stepped forward and claimed her own stage. The wind moved through the avenue, cool and steady, carrying with it the low hum of traffic and distant applause still echoing in memory. Somewhere behind the curtain, Imani removed the gown with careful hands, folded it respectfully, and met her reflection in the mirror once more. The woman looking back at her was not a project, not a supporting figure, not a silent adjustment in someone else's equation. She was the closing statement. And outside, beneath towering screens and the unblinking eyes of Manhattan, Jonathan Hale stood very still, watching the city illuminate her name without his. The morning after the show, Manhattan woke up louder than usual, or maybe it only felt that way to Jonathan Hale. Financial news tickers rolled across television screens in his penthouse kitchen, but his attention was fixed on a different kind of headline glowing from his tablet. Images from the runway dominated fashion columns and mainstream media feeds alike. The closing look described as commanding, magnetic, unforgettable. Her name appeared in bold type across multiple platforms, not as an attachment to his, but standing alone. Imani Brooks. Not Hale. Brooks. The detail tightened something in his chest that he could not immediately name. Across the Marble Island, Imani moved quietly, pouring a glass of water, her posture relaxed in a way he had not seen in years. She wore simple jeans and a soft gray sweater, no dramatic styling, no visible trace of the stage lights from the night before. Yet the air around her felt different, as if it had expanded. "You dropped my last name in the interviews," Jonathan said finally, keeping his tone measured. She set the glass down carefully before answering. "I used my own." He studied her profile, searching for defensiveness, but found none. "It looks intentional," he pressed. "It is," she replied. Silence settled between them, not hostile but revealing. He had built companies by identifying leverage points, by recognizing where influence could be applied. Yet sitting across from her now, he sensed that influence no longer moved in predictable directions. His phone vibrated repeatedly, with congratulatory messages from associates who had seen the coverage. A few were tinged with surprise, a few with curiosity, none with the certainty he was accustomed to controlling. "The foundation board is meeting this afternoon," he said, almost to himself. "They will ask questions." She met his eyes calmly. "Then answer them." He exhaled slowly. "You are comfortable with this level of exposure?" "I am comfortable with myself," she said. The difference was subtle but profound. Later that day, as Jonathan stepped into his boardroom overlooking the park, his colleagues greeted him with polite nods that carried new undertones. A senior partner adjusted her glasses. "Impressive show," she remarked. "Your wife has quite a presence." He hesitated before responding. "She does." The acknowledgement felt unfamiliar, stripped of ownership. Meanwhile, across town, Imani sat in a bright studio for her first post-show interview. The room was minimal, soft lights positioned strategically, a neutral backdrop behind her. The interviewer, a poised woman with a notepad balanced on her knee, leaned forward with interest. "Last night was a defining moment," she began. "Many people did not know you were returning to modeling. What changed?" Imani folded her hands loosely in her lap. "Nothing changed," she said gently. "I remembered." The interviewer paused, intrigued. "Remembered what?" "That I do not need permission to take up space," she answered. The words were not delivered as a challenge. They were delivered as fact. Outside the studio windows, traffic moved steadily along 8th Avenue, horns echoing faintly upward. Inside, the interviewer nodded slowly. "Some have described your walk as authoritative. Intentional. Was that deliberate?" Imani allowed a small smile. It was honest. By the time she left the building, notifications flooded her phone. New followers. Invitations. A message from a national magazine requesting a feature profile. She scrolled past them without urgency, absorbing the shift not as spectacle, but as confirmation. Back at Hale Ventures, Jonathan stood alone in his office after the board meeting had adjourned. The questions had been diplomatic, but pointed. Will this affect the brand? Is the increased visibility an asset or a distraction? He had answered with composure, emphasizing alignment, emphasizing opportunity. Yet beneath the strategic language, he felt the deeper reality pressing against him. For years he had positioned himself as the architect of every narrative connected to his name. Now, a story had unfolded without his direction, and it was thriving. That evening, they attended the foundation's annual donor reception as planned. The ballroom was elegant, understated. A sea of navy suits and silk dresses under soft golden chandeliers. Whispers traveled faster than champagne. Heads turned when Imani entered, not because she was his wife, but because she was recognized. The Langfords approached with bright smiles. "We saw the show," Mrs. Langford exclaimed. "You were extraordinary." Imani thanked her with genuine warmth. Jonathan watched the exchange carefully, aware of how the balance of introduction had shifted. Instead of presenting her as an extension of his success, he found himself saying simply, "You already know Imani." Later, standing near the edge of the room, he leaned slightly closer to her. "You handled the board questions better than I expected," he admitted quietly. She looked at him evenly. "I have handled worse." The memory of his past jokes flickered briefly between them, unspoken but undeniable. For a moment, he seemed smaller within his own tailored frame, as if the architecture of superiority he had once relied upon had thinned. "I did not see this coming," he said. It was not an accusation. It was an admission. "You did not look," she replied. The music shifted into a softer tempo as donors moved toward the dance floor. Photographers discreetly captured images of notable guests. One lens turned toward them. This time, when the flash ignited, Jonathan did not tighten his hand at her waist to guide her posture. He allowed her to stand as she wished, shoulders squared, gaze steady. The photograph that appeared online the next morning told a different story than any taken in previous years. She was centered. He was beside her, not leading, not overshadowing, simply present. That night, back in the quiet of their penthouse, the city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Jonathan stood near the window, hands in his pockets, watching traffic weave below. "I underestimated you," he said at last. The words carried weight, not because they were dramatic, but because they were rare. Imani remained seated on the sofa, shoes removed, posture relaxed. "You underestimated yourself," she corrected gently. He turned toward her, brow slightly furrowed. "How so?" "You thought diminishing me made you stronger," she said. "It only made you smaller." The statement landed without cruelty. It landed with clarity. He absorbed it in silence. Outside, a billboard across the avenue flickered briefly with a looping image from the runway, her silhouette still commanding under bright white lights. The reflection of that image cast faintly across the glass of their penthouse window, overlaying the skyline with her form. For the first time, Jonathan did not view it as competition for attention or risk to his empire. He saw it as evidence of something he had failed to nurture but could no longer deny. The balance between them had shifted not through spectacle, but through self-possession. And as the city continued to hum beneath them, relentless and bright, the architecture of their marriage stood at a quiet crossroads, no longer defined by hierarchy, but by the possibility of reckoning. The city did not slow down after the headlines faded into the next news cycle, and neither did Imani. Within a week of the show, her calendar filled with fittings, interviews, and strategy meetings that had nothing to do with Jonathan's foundation or investment portfolio. The mornings in the penthouse shifted from quiet routine to parallel motion. He reviewed market forecasts at the Marble Island while she answered emails from stylists and creative directors. The distance between them was no longer measured in silence, but in direction. One evening, as rain streaked down the glass walls in thin silver lines, Jonathan stood in the living room watching her sort through garment bags delivered from a major American fashion house. The labels were understated but unmistakable. "Paris is asking," she said calmly, reading from her phone. "They want me for a campaign shoot next month." The word Paris hovered between them like a test. He crossed his arms, not defensively, but thoughtfully. "That is not a local commitment," he said. "It is not," she agreed. He walked closer, stopping a few feet away, the rain casting blurred reflections across the polished floor. "Do you want this?" he asked. It was a different question than he would have asked weeks earlier. She looked up from the garment bag, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." He studied her for a long moment, searching for uncertainty and finding none. "Then you should go," he said finally. The statement surprised them both. She did not smile in triumph. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the shift. In the weeks that followed, her image appeared in national campaigns, on magazine covers displayed in grocery store checkout lines and airport kiosks across the country. Her name was no longer introduced as an extension of his. It carried its own gravity. Meanwhile, at Hale Ventures, Jonathan began noticing subtle changes in how he spoke about her. In meetings, when colleagues referenced her rising profile, he no longer minimized it as a hobby or a temporary spotlight. He described her work as disciplined, strategic, intentional. The language mirrored how he spoke about his own ventures. One afternoon, during a leadership summit hosted in a midtown hotel ballroom, a young entrepreneur approached him after his keynote speech. "Your wife's interview last week," the man said, adjusting his tie nervously. It resonated. The part where she said she did not need permission to take up space. That stuck with me. Jonathan paused before responding. "It stuck with me too," he admitted. That evening, back home, he found Imani standing on the balcony overlooking the river, the skyline shimmering in soft blue dusk. She was on a call with her agent, discussing travel dates and creative direction. When she ended the call, she remained facing the water, hands resting lightly on the railing. "You are building something," he said quietly from the doorway. She did not turn immediately. "So are you," she replied. The wind carried the distant hum of traffic upward, steady and unrelenting. He stepped beside her, leaving space between them but closing the emotional distance that had defined their marriage for years. "I thought control was stability," he said after a moment. "I thought if I managed every variable, nothing could threaten what we built." She looked at him then, her expression neither harsh nor forgiving, simply aware. "And what did you learn?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "That control is not the same as respect." The confession was quiet, but it carried more weight than any public apology. She studied his face, searching for performance and finding sincerity. "Respect does not shrink someone," she said. "It makes room." He nodded, absorbing the simplicity of the truth. Days later, as preparations for her Paris campaign intensified, the penthouse transformed into a temporary studio, garment racks lining the hallway, stylists conducting quick fittings under portable lights. Jonathan moved through the space carefully, not displaced, but observing. At one point, he paused near a mirror where Imani stood reviewing a mood board with her creative team. She caught his reflection behind her. "You used to joke about this world," she said gently once the team stepped aside. He did not deny it. "I did not understand it," he replied. "And I was afraid of what I could not control." She turned fully toward him, the soft glow of the lights illuminating the steady confidence in her posture. "You do not have to control it," she said. "You only have to respect it." The night before her departure, they attended a private dinner hosted by a major publication celebrating influential figures across industries. The guest list was curated, the lighting intimate but deliberate. As they entered, conversations paused briefly before resuming in animated tones. This time, introductions flowed differently. Imani Brooks, the editor-in-chief, greeted warmly, extending a hand. We are honored. Jonathan stood beside her, listening as she spoke about creative autonomy and representation with clarity and depth. When the editor turned to him, it was not to confirm her relevance, but to acknowledge their partnership. You must be proud, she said. He glanced at Imani, then back at the editor. I am, he answered, and the words were unburdened by ego. Later that night, as they returned home beneath a sky streaked with faint city haze, Jonathan stopped near the building entrance before stepping inside. You once told me that diminishing you made me smaller, he said. She waited, steady. I understand that now. She regarded him carefully. Understanding is not the same as changing, she replied. He met her gaze without defensiveness. Then I will change. The elevator ride to the penthouse was quiet, not strained but reflective. When the doors opened to the expanse of glass and city light, Imani walked to the window one more time, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond. In the reflection, she saw not just herself, but the outline of a man learning to stand beside her without overshadowing her. The journey ahead was not defined by spectacle or revenge, but by recalibration. She had reclaimed her light without asking for permission. Now the question was whether he could learn to honor it without trying to own it. Outside, the city pulsed with the same relentless rhythm that had witnessed her transformation. Inside, beneath towering glass and quiet resolve, two people stood at the edge of something new, not built on hierarchy, but on the possibility of earned respect. Paris unfolded in pale winter light, the Seine reflecting a soft silver glow beneath low clouds, and Imani stood at the balcony of her hotel suite, overlooking slate rooftops and narrow streets humming with quiet morning traffic. The air was different here, thinner somehow, touched with history and restraint. Inside, garment racks lined the walls, stylists moving in efficient silence as they prepared for the first day of shooting. The campaign was for a heritage fashion house known for precision and power, not excess, and the creative director had chosen an old stone courtyard for the opening sequence, its archways weathered but dignified. Imani watched the crew assemble below, cameras mounted on smooth tracking rigs, reflectors catching the gray daylight. Thousands of miles away, in Manhattan, Jonathan sat in his office with the skyline stretched behind him like a familiar blueprint. He had just finished a conference call when his assistant stepped in quietly. The European press has picked up the campaign teaser, she said, placing a tablet on his desk. On the screen, a short preview clip looped in muted repetition. Imani walked through the courtyard in a tailored wool coat, wind lifting the hem slightly, her stride deliberate, her gaze fixed forward. The caption beneath read, "A new era of strength." He leaned back in his chair, absorbing the image without commentary. This was no longer a surprise development. It was a sustained ascent. Back in Paris, the director approached her between takes. "We want restraint," he said in accented English. "Power without performance." She nodded, understanding the distinction. When the cameras rolled again, she walked the length of the courtyard with quiet certainty, her presence shaping the space rather than being shaped by it. The crew fell into a rhythm around her, the shoot unfolding with disciplined efficiency. Between scenes, she stepped aside to review footage with the creative team. "Your stillness speaks," the director said softly. "It demands attention." She smiled faintly. It took time to learn that. That evening, after the final shot wrapped, she returned to her suite and opened her laptop to join a video call scheduled across time zones. Jonathan's face appeared on the screen, the New York skyline glowing in twilight behind him. For a moment, they simply looked at one another, the distance between continents softened by the shared rectangle of light. "I saw the teaser," he said. "It is remarkable." She tilted her head slightly. "You sound surprised." He shook his head. "Not surprised. Adjusting." She considered the word. "To what?" "To standing beside someone who does not need my shadow," he answered. The honesty in his voice traveled clearly through the connection. She leaned back in her chair, Paris lights flickering through the window behind her. "I never needed it," she said gently. "You assumed I did." He did not argue. "I am learning," he said. Slowly. Outside her window, church bells rang faintly in the distance, marking the hour. "Learning is not about words," she replied. "It is about behavior." He nodded, absorbing the quiet instruction. "Then let me start with this," he said. When you return, I want to restructure the foundation board. More independent voices. Less of mine dominating every decision. She watched him carefully, assessing whether the gesture was strategic or sincere. Why? She asked. He held her gaze. Because I do not want control to be my default anymore. The statement lingered in the air between them. That is a beginning, she said at last. The following day, the full campaign images launched across digital platforms and billboards in both Paris and New York. On Fifth Avenue, a massive screen displayed her portrait in the structured coat, chin lifted, expression composed but unyielding. Pedestrians paused beneath it, some raising phones, others simply watching. Jonathan stood across the street from the display that evening, coat collar turned up against the cold, traffic rushing past in steady waves. He did not announce his presence. He did not call her to narrate the moment. He simply observed the way strangers looked up at her image with curiosity and respect. A young woman beside him whispered to her friend, "She looks like she owns the city." Jonathan allowed himself a quiet exhale. She did not look owned. She looked sovereign. When Imani returned to Manhattan 3 days later, the penthouse felt both familiar and subtly altered. The city lights welcomed her back with the same relentless glow, but the atmosphere inside was different. Jonathan met her at the door, not with grand gestures, but with steady presence. "Welcome home," he said. She stepped inside, placing her suitcase near the entryway. "It is good to be back," she replied. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I scheduled a meeting with the board next week to discuss restructuring." She searched his expression for calculation and found none. "You do not have to prove anything to me," she said. "This is not about proving," he answered. "It is about aligning." Later that night, they stood together at the balcony overlooking the river, the water reflecting streaks of gold from passing boats. "Do you regret anything?" he asked quietly. She considered the question carefully. "Regret implies I would undo it," she said. "I would not." He nodded slowly. "Then neither will I." The wind moved between them, cool and steady, carrying the layered sounds of Manhattan upward. For years, the architecture of their marriage had been built on imbalance disguised as protection. Now, piece by piece, that structure was being examined, recalibrated. She had reclaimed her light in cities thousands of miles apart. He was learning that respect did not diminish his strength. It refined it. As the skyline stretched endlessly before them, illuminated and unashamed, Imani rested her hands lightly on the balcony railing, her posture relaxed yet unyielding. Beside her, Jonathan stood without trying to lead the view. The city did not need to dim for her to shine. And for the first time, neither did he. The restructuring meeting at Hale Foundation took place on a gray Monday morning beneath a ceiling of recessed lights that cast an even, unforgiving glow across the long walnut conference table. The skyline beyond the glass walls looked subdued, clouds pressing low over Manhattan, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Jonathan stood at the head of the table, not with his usual relaxed dominance, but with deliberate steadiness. The board members watched him with polite curiosity, tablets open, notepads ready. Imani sat halfway down the table, not at the periphery as she once would have, but neither at the center. She had not asked for the position. It had simply become natural. "I want to revise our governance structure," Jonathan began, his voice measured but clear. "More independent oversight. Rotating advisory chairs. And I would like Imani to serve as co-chair on all community initiatives." A few eyebrows lifted. One longtime board member leaned back slightly. "That is a significant shift," he said. "It is," Jonathan agreed. "Our foundation cannot preach empowerment while practicing hierarchy internally." The statement landed with quiet force. Imani did not look at him immediately. She kept her posture relaxed, hands folded loosely before her, absorbing the moment without claiming it. When the discussion opened to comments, she spoke only once. "Impact requires perspective," she said calmly. And perspective expands when more than one voice shapes the direction. There was no performance in her tone, only conviction. By the end of the meeting, the motion passed with measured approval. It was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Outside the building, the wind cut through the avenue, brisk and bracing. Jonathan walked beside Imani toward the curb where a car waited. "You did not need to be there," he said quietly. "But I am glad you were." She glanced at him briefly. "I was not there for you," she replied. "I was there for the work." He nodded once, accepting the distinction. Later that week, she received an invitation that shifted the axis of their private recalibration into public view. A national morning show requested her presence for a live segment on resilience and reinvention. The studio was located in a bright midtown building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a bustling plaza. On the morning of the interview, she arrived in a tailored ivory suit, understated but precise, her posture composed as makeup artists adjusted lighting tones around her. The host greeted her warmly on air. "Your journey has inspired so many," he began. "What would you say to someone who feels unseen in their own life?" The question hovered in the studio, amplified by cameras and silent crew members. Imani did not rush her response. "Being unseen does not mean you are invisible," she said. "It means you are waiting for the right light." The words traveled beyond the studio walls within minutes, clipped into sound bites, shared across social feeds. Jonathan watched from his office, the muted broadcast playing on a large screen. Colleagues paused by his doorway, offering approving nods. "She is compelling," one remarked. Jonathan did not deflect. "She is," he agreed. That evening, they attended a private dinner hosted by a philanthropic coalition bringing together leaders from technology, fashion, and nonprofit sectors. The setting was intimate, a converted brownstone lit by warm sconces and candlelight. Conversations flowed easily, blending strategy with personal reflection. When Imani described her vision for expanding mentorship programs for young women of color entering creative industries, the table listened without interruption. Jonathan observed the shift not as a spectator, but as a participant in something larger than his own brand. At one point, a venture capitalist across the table addressed him directly. "You have built a remarkable empire," the man said. "But this," he gestured subtly toward Imani, "this feels like legacy." Jonathan looked at her, then back at the man. "Legacy requires partnership," he replied. The answer was not rehearsed. It was realized. Days later, as autumn edged closer and the air sharpened with hints of approaching winter, a prominent magazine published a feature profile on Imani titled "The Architecture of Self-Respect." The cover image showed her standing against a minimalist backdrop, expression calm but resolute. The article detailed her early career, the pause, the return, and the philosophy guiding her next chapter. It did not frame her as rescued or redeemed by marriage. It framed her as self-directed. Jonathan held a physical copy in his hands that night, flipping through the pages slowly. He paused at a quote highlighted in bold. "Respect is not granted by proximity. It is claimed by presence." He closed the magazine and looked across the living room where she sat reviewing campaign schedules. "You have changed the conversation," he said quietly. She did not look up immediately. "I changed myself," she replied. The distinction settled gently between them. A week later, they stood together at a gala honoring innovators across industries. The ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers and low orchestral music. Photographers lined the entrance, flashes igniting in rhythmic bursts. This time, when they stepped onto the carpet, Jonathan did not guide her position or adjust her stance. He stood beside her, hands relaxed at his sides. When reporters called out questions, they directed most of them toward her. "What is next?" one asked. She answered without hesitation. "Expansion," she said. "Of opportunity. Of voice." Jonathan listened as she spoke, not as a manager evaluating performance, but as a partner witnessing evolution. Later, as they exited into the cool night air, the city pulsed around them with restless energy. A towering digital screen across the street displayed rotating images from the gala. Her face appeared briefly among them, luminous and composed. Jonathan followed her gaze upward. "You once stood in this city and felt small," he said softly. She met his eyes, not offended by the memory. "No," she corrected gently. "I felt diminished." "That is different." He absorbed the nuance. "And now?" he asked. She looked back at the skyline, at the endless grid of lights stretching toward the horizon. "Now I feel proportionate," she said. "Exactly as large. As I was meant to be." The wind lifted her hair slightly, the city noise rising and falling like distant waves. Jonathan stood beside her, no longer attempting to define the scale. He understood at last that her expansion did not reduce him. It invited him to expand as well. And beneath the bright, unblinking lights of Manhattan, their reflection in the glass storefront across the avenue showed two figures standing shoulder to shoulder, not in hierarchy, not in shadow, but in earned alignment. Winter settled fully over Manhattan, the air sharper now, the river reflecting a hard silver beneath a sky that seemed carved from glass. Inside the penthouse, the warmth from the fireplace softened the edges of the evening, flames flickering against the marble surround as city lights stretched endlessly beyond the windows. Imani stood near the dining table reviewing architectural sketches spread carefully across the surface, not of buildings, but of something equally deliberate. The sketches outlined a new initiative she had been shaping quietly for weeks, a mentorship and scholarship program designed to fund emerging creatives from underserved communities. The title written across the top page read Brooks Initiative for Creative Equity. Jonathan entered from his office, jacket loosened, tie removed, the long day etched lightly across his features. He paused when he saw the documents. "You are building something again," he observed, not as a question. She looked up, her expression steady. "I am expanding," she replied. He stepped closer, scanning the outlines of budgets, partnerships, and strategic frameworks. "You are funding this personally?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. "With the first campaign earnings." He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that choice. "And you did not consult me." There was no accusation in his tone, only recognition. "I did not need to," she said gently. The fireplace crackled softly between them. For years, major financial decisions had passed through his approval, his systems, his oversight. Now, she was drafting blueprints of impact with independent precision. He exhaled slowly. "Tell me how I can support it," he said. The shift in phrasing was subtle but undeniable. She studied him for a moment, then gestured toward a chair. "Sit," she said. "Listen." He did. She outlined the mission in clear language, describing mentorship pipelines, industry access, sustainable funding models. Her voice carried the same composed authority she had displayed on the runway and in boardrooms. When she finished, the room felt charged not with tension, but with possibility. "You have thought this through," he said quietly. "I have had years to think," she replied. He allowed the truth of that to settle. Outside, snow began to fall in fine, deliberate flakes, drifting past the glass like quiet punctuation. Days later, the initiative launched with a press release that carried her name in bold across national platforms. Headlines described her not only as a model, but as a founder. The narrative was no longer about reinvention alone. It was about infrastructure. Jonathan read the coverage from his office, recognizing how seamlessly her identity had evolved beyond any role he once defined for her. At a televised panel discussion hosted at a Midtown Cultural Center, she stood beneath bright stage lights beside other industry leaders, speaking about access and representation with calm conviction. "Visibility is powerful," she said into the microphone, her voice amplified across the auditorium. "But opportunity is transformative." The audience responded with sustained applause. In the front row, Jonathan sat with hands clasped loosely, watching not as a strategist, but as a witness to scale. After the panel, as guests mingled beneath soft ambient lighting, a young designer approached Imani with visible emotion. "Your words mattered," she said. "You made space for people like me." Imani smiled warmly. "You were always meant to have space," she replied. Jonathan observed the exchange from a few steps away, understanding that the architecture of influence she was building extended far beyond fashion campaigns or media moments. It was structural. It was lasting. Later that evening, as they returned home through streets dusted lightly with snow, the city felt quieter, reflective. In the elevator, he glanced at her profile illuminated by soft overhead light. "I used to think success meant being the loudest voice in the room," he said. She turned slightly toward him. "And now?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Now I think it means knowing when to amplify someone else." The elevator doors opened to the expansive calm of their penthouse. She stepped inside first, moving toward the window where snow continued to drift across the skyline. He joined her, standing close but not crowding the view. "Do you remember that night at the ballroom?" he asked quietly. She did not need clarification. "I do," she said. "I remember every word." The memory did not carry heat anymore. It carried contrast. "I was careless," he admitted, "and arrogant." She did not soften the assessment. "Yes," she agreed. He nodded once, accepting the simplicity of truth. "I cannot undo that," he continued. "But I can ensure I never speak of you as anything less than your equal again." The snow thickened beyond the glass, softening the edges of skyscrapers, transforming the city into a quieter landscape. Equality is not declared, she said gently. It is practiced. He absorbed the instruction, not defensively, but deliberately. Weeks later, at the inaugural gala for the Brooks Initiative, the ballroom was filled with young creatives, mentors, donors, and press. The atmosphere pulsed with optimism rather than spectacle. On stage, Imani delivered the keynote address, her voice resonant and steady. She spoke about dignity, about reclaiming space, about building ladders rather than waiting for doors to open. In the front row, Jonathan sat without needing introduction. When the event concluded and guests filtered toward the exit beneath chandeliers casting warm gold light, a photographer asked them to stand together for a final image. This time, no one arranged their positions. They stood naturally, shoulder to shoulder. The flash illuminated not hierarchy, but alignment. Later that night, as the city glowed beneath fresh snowfall, they stood once more at the balcony overlooking the river. The skyline shimmered softly, the world quieter than usual. "You are not my charity project," he said finally, the words steady and unembellished. She looked at him, not with triumph, but with clarity. "No," she replied. "I never was." The wind moved gently between them, carrying the distant hum of a city that had watched her shrink and then rise. In the reflection of the glass, two figures stood evenly framed against an illuminated horizon. She had claimed her light without permission. He had learned to stand within it without trying to own it. And beneath the falling snow, the architecture of their future rested not on dominance, but on deliberate respect. Spring arrived without ceremony, melting the last traces of snow from Manhattan sidewalks and replacing the winter hush with a restless brightness that seemed to echo the new rhythm inside the Hale penthouse. The Brooks Initiative had begun accepting its first class of fellows, and the living room that once hosted quiet donor cocktails was now filled with large presentation boards, mentorship outlines, and framed acceptance letters, waiting to be mailed. Imani stood near the window early one morning, sunlight stretching across the hardwood floors in long golden lines, reading through the final list of selected applicants. Each name represented a story interrupted by circumstance, talent paused by limited access, ambition waiting for infrastructure. Jonathan entered carrying 2 mugs of coffee, pausing briefly as he watched her silhouette against the skyline. There was a steadiness to her now that did not fluctuate with headlines or applause. It was internal. "You have built momentum," he said quietly, handing her a mug. "Momentum is fragile if it is not sustained," she replied, eyes still scanning the page. He nodded, absorbing the discipline in her thinking. Across town, the first orientation session for the Brooks Initiative took place in a renovated warehouse studio in Brooklyn, sunlight flooding through tall industrial windows onto rows of folding chairs arranged with intentional simplicity. The selected fellows, diverse in age and background, sat upright with anticipation written across their faces. When Imani stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room, there were no chandeliers or camera flashes, only attentive silence. She wore a simple navy dress, minimal jewelry, her posture aligned not with performance, but with purpose. "This is not charity," she began, her voice clear without strain. "This is investment." The words traveled through the room with weight. Jonathan stood at the back, unnoticed by most, observing the shift in atmosphere as she spoke about ownership, creative equity, and sustainable success. He had once believed leadership required occupying the front of every room. Watching her command attention without raising her voice altered that definition permanently. After the session concluded, a young photographer approached her with tears she did not attempt to hide. "You changed how I see my own potential," she said softly. Imani placed a steady hand over the woman's. "You already had it," she replied. Jonathan witnessed the exchange with quiet reflection. Later that afternoon, they returned to Hale Ventures for a scheduled media briefing announcing a collaborative partnership between his firm and the Brooks Initiative. The press room was bright and controlled, microphones aligned neatly across a polished table. Journalists filled the seats, cameras positioned strategically. Jonathan began the announcement, outlining the financial commitment and structural support his firm would provide. But when he finished, he turned deliberately toward Imani. "The vision is hers," he said into the microphone. "We are here to amplify it." The room shifted subtly, reporters scribbling faster, lenses adjusting focus. Imani spoke next, her tone composed, her message consistent. Partnership is not absorption, she said. It is alignment. The phrase appeared in headlines within hours. That evening, as they walked through Central Park beneath trees newly dressed in pale green leaves, the city carried a lighter energy. Joggers passed. Children laughed in the distance, the skyline rising beyond the treetops like a reminder of scale. Jonathan slowed his pace slightly. "Do you ever resent me?" he asked quietly, the question unexpected but sincere. She considered it carefully before answering. "Resentment requires staying," she said. I moved forward. He absorbed the nuance. "And us?" he pressed gently. She stopped walking, turning to face him beneath the filtered afternoon light. "Us depends on consistency," she said. "Not moments." He nodded once, understanding that transformation was not proven in speeches or gestures, but in sustained behavior. Weeks later, as the Brooks Initiative Fellows began their first mentorship placements, Imani received an invitation to deliver a keynote address at a national economic forum in Washington, D.C. The auditorium was vast, filled with policymakers, executives, and entrepreneurs. The stage lights were bright but controlled, the audience expectant. Jonathan sat in the front row, no longer as a dominant presence, but as an attentive partner. When she spoke about systemic access and redefining influence, the room listened with rare stillness. "Power without inclusion is fragile," she said. "Inclusion without respect is hollow." The applause that followed was not explosive, but sustained and thoughtful. Later, backstage, a senior senator approached her with visible admiration. "Your perspective is needed," he said. Jonathan stood nearby, witnessing not competition for relevance, but expansion of impact. Back in Manhattan that night, the penthouse felt less like a symbol of achievement and more like a quiet vantage point overlooking a shared horizon. They stood together at the window once more, the river reflecting the scattered lights of passing boats. "You have redefined what success looks like for me," Jonathan admitted softly. She looked at him, neither triumphant nor surprised. "Success is not a spotlight," she said. "It is a structure." He smiled faintly at the metaphor. "And structures require maintenance," he added. She inclined her head slightly. "Exactly." The city beyond them pulsed with steady life, unbothered by individual transformations, yet illuminated by them. All the same, in the reflection of the glass, their figures stood evenly framed against the vastness of Manhattan, no longer divided by shadow or dominance. The journey from dismissal to dignity had not been loud. It had been deliberate. She had reclaimed her space without bitterness. He had learned that respect was not an accessory to power, but its foundation. And as spring deepened over the city, carrying with it the promise of growth and renewal, the architecture of their shared future rested not on spectacle, but on sustained, practiced equality. Summer arrived in Manhattan with unapologetic brightness, sunlight stretching longer across the river and casting sharp reflections against the glass towers that framed the Hale penthouse. The air felt expansive, restless, alive with possibility. Inside, the atmosphere carried the same quiet evolution that had been building for months. The Brooks Initiative had completed its first mentorship cycle, and the results were no longer projections on presentation boards, but lived outcomes. Fellows had secured internships, gallery placements, editorial features. The initiative was no longer an idea defended in conference rooms. It was proof. One morning, Imani stood at the kitchen island reviewing a thick report summarizing the program's measurable impact. Charts, testimonials, financial transparency documents. Structure beneath vision. Jonathan watched her from across the room, not intruding, not directing. "You have data now," he said softly. She looked up, sunlight illuminating the calm assurance in her expression. "Data is protection," she replied. "It turns belief into evidence." He nodded, recognizing the language of sustainability. That afternoon, a major philanthropic consortium invited her to present the initiative at their annual summit in San Francisco. The venue overlooked the bay, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Golden Gate Bridge in muted orange against a blue horizon. The room was filled with investors accustomed to metrics and measurable return. When Imani stepped to the podium, she did not begin with emotion. She began with structure. "This is not a moment," she said clearly. It is a model. She detailed funding streams, mentorship ratios, longitudinal tracking. The audience leaned forward, not out of curiosity alone, but respect. Jonathan sat several rows back, listening as she navigated questions with precision. When a panelist asked whether the initiative relied too heavily on her personal brand, she did not flinch. Personal visibility opens doors, she answered. Institutional design keeps them open. The clarity in her voice filled the room. Later, during a private reception overlooking the water, an influential investor approached Jonathan with a contemplative smile. She thinks like a founder, the man observed. Jonathan did not hesitate. She is one, he replied. The acknowledgement carried no shadow of ownership. Back in Manhattan days later, the penthouse felt quieter, grounded in routine rather than reinvention. Jonathan had begun adjusting his own leadership approach at Hale Ventures, delegating more authority, inviting dissenting perspectives into strategy sessions. The changes were subtle but consistent. One evening, as they reviewed separate documents at the long dining table, he paused. The board approved full autonomy for the Community Initiatives Division, he said. No executive override. Imani looked up slowly. That is significant, she replied. It is necessary, he answered. The city outside buzzed with summer traffic, taxi horns rising and falling like a distant pulse. She studied his expression, searching for performance. There was none, only alignment. Weeks later, a national business publication released a joint feature on them titled Redefining Partnership in Modern Leadership. The cover image showed them standing side by side against the Manhattan skyline, neither leading nor following. The article traced not scandal or spectacle, but recalibration. When Jonathan read the final draft before publication, he paused at a quote attributed to Imani. Growth requires discomfort. Respect requires consistency. He set the tablet down and looked across the room where she stood near the window, reviewing emails. You were right, he said quietly. She turned slightly. About what? Equality is practiced, he answered. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. That autumn, the Brooks Initiative hosted its first national conference in Chicago, the city where her early modeling career had once begun. The ballroom was expansive but intentional, decorated not with excess but with purpose. Fellows from across the country gathered, their projects displayed in curated installations around the perimeter. Imani took the stage under warm, focused lights, her voice resonant without strain. There was a time, she began, when I believed shrinking was survival. The audience stilled. I was wrong. The words carried through the room with quiet force. Jonathan sat in the front row, remembering the ballroom where he had once diminished her publicly. The contrast was not painful. It was instructive. After the keynote, as applause lingered in the air, she stepped down from the stage and moved through the crowd. With ease, engaging in conversations, listening as much as she spoke. Jonathan approached her near an installation showcasing one fellow's photography series. You have built something enduring, he said. She glanced at the images on the wall, then back at him. So have you, she replied. He shook his head gently. Not like this. She smiled faintly. Then build differently. The simplicity of the challenge did not intimidate him. It invited growth. Later that night, back in their hotel suite overlooking the Chicago skyline, they stood side by side near the window, city lights reflecting off Lake Michigan in scattered patterns. Do you forgive me? He asked quietly, the question surfacing without preparation. She did not answer immediately. She watched the water for a long moment before speaking. Forgiveness is not forgetting, she said softly. It is choosing not to anchor there. He absorbed the weight of that distinction. And have you chosen? He asked. She turned toward him fully. I chose the moment I stepped back into myself, she replied. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no cinematic declaration. Only steady understanding. Months later, as the year edged toward its close, Manhattan glowed once more beneath winter lights. The Brooks Initiative prepared to announce its second cohort, twice the size of the first. Hale Ventures reported record profits under its restructured leadership model. The transformation was not explosive. It was architectural. One evening, standing together on the penthouse balcony beneath a sky dusted with early snow, Jonathan looked at her reflection in the glass. You changed everything, he said softly. She shook her head gently. No, she replied. I revealed it. The wind moved around them, cool and steady, carrying the layered sounds of a city that had witnessed their evolution. In the mirrored surface before them, two figures stood evenly framed against an illuminated skyline. She had reclaimed her dignity without asking for validation. He had learned that strength was not dominance, but discipline. And beneath the unblinking lights of Manhattan, their future rested not on past imbalance, but on sustained, practiced respect. The year closed beneath a sky streaked with winter light, Manhattan glittering in restrained brilliance, as if the city itself understood the difference between spectacle and substance. Inside the penthouse, the air felt calm, not because nothing had changed, but because everything had. The Brooks Initiative had announced its second cohort that morning. The applicant pool tripled, partnerships solidified, endowments secured for long-term sustainability. Across the dining table, neatly stacked folders carried names that would soon reshape industries in ways headlines could not yet predict. Imani stood near the window, hands resting lightly on the cool glass, watching snow drift between skyscrapers like quiet affirmation. Jonathan approached without interruption, his reflection appearing beside hers in the window pane. He did not speak immediately. He had learned the value of silence when it was intentional. "They will remember you for this," he said at last, voice steady. She did not turn. "I am not building memory," she replied. "I am building access." The distinction lingered between them, gentle but firm. Weeks earlier, a global leadership summit had extended an invitation to both of them to deliver a joint address on modern partnership in business and philanthropy. The event would take place in Los Angeles, broadcast nationally, an audience of executives, creators, policymakers filling a vast auditorium beneath precise stage lighting. On the night of the address, the air backstage carried the quiet intensity of preparation. Assistants adjusted microphones. A production manager counted down minutes. Imani stood composed in a tailored, deep emerald suit, minimal jewelry catching the light subtly. Jonathan stood beside her in a charcoal suit, posture aligned not with command, but with clarity. "No script changes?" he asked softly. "No," she answered. "Honesty is enough." When they stepped onto the stage, the applause was sustained but measured. The moderator introduced them not as a power couple, not as an empire, but as partners in recalibration. Jonathan spoke first, his voice resonant but unforced. "There was a time when I believed leadership meant dominance," he said, eyes scanning the audience without deflection. "I was wrong." The room stilled. He continued, not dramatizing, not defending. "I learned that control without respect creates imbalance. And imbalance, no matter how polished, eventually fractures." He turned slightly toward Imani, not to defer, but to align. She stepped forward next, the stage lights illuminating her calm authority. "Respect is not requested," she said. "It is practiced consistently, especially when no one is watching." The words settled across the auditorium with quiet power. She did not recount the past with bitterness. She did not narrate humiliation. She spoke of growth, of accountability, of expansion without erasure. When the moderator asked what transformation required most, she answered without hesitation. "Courage to examine yourself without applause." The applause that followed was not explosive. It was reflective. Back in Manhattan days later, life resumed its steady rhythm. Hale Ventures reported its most stable quarter in years, not because Jonathan had tightened control, but because he had distributed it. The Brooks Initiative announced satellite partnerships in Atlanta and Chicago, cities that had once shaped Imani's early ambitions. One evening, as they walked through Central Park beneath bare winter branches dusted lightly with frost, Jonathan slowed near a bench overlooking the lake. "If I had never changed," he asked quietly, "would you have left?" She stopped, considering the question beneath the pale afternoon sky. "I already had," she said gently. He absorbed the truth without resistance. "And you came back," he observed. "No," she corrected softly. "You caught up." The distinction did not wound him. It clarified the path they had taken. Later that night, back at the penthouse, a package arrived addressed solely to Imani. Inside was the first printed annual report of the Brooks Initiative, its cover simple and deliberate, her name embossed not in gold, but in restrained black lettering. She opened it slowly, turning pages filled with data, photographs, testimonials from fellows whose lives had shifted direction. Jonathan watched from a respectful distance. "You did this," he said quietly. She closed the report and looked at him. "We did different work," she replied. He nodded once, understanding that equality did not erase individual ownership. It honored it. As midnight approached on the final evening of the year, the skyline beyond the glass erupted in early fireworks from distant rooftops, small bursts of light scattering across the dark canvas of night. The city prepared to count down, to celebrate, to declare renewal. Inside, there was no countdown, no spectacle, only reflection. They stood together at the balcony, the cold air sharp but invigorating, the river below carrying scattered reflections of color. "There was a night," Jonathan said softly, "when I reduced you to a joke in a room full of people." The memory no longer carried shame. It carried instruction. "Yes," she answered calmly. "There was." He met her gaze fully. "I will never forget it." She studied his expression, searching not for regret alone, but for integration. "Good," she said. "Do not forget who you were. Just do not return to him." The fireworks intensified briefly, casting bright color across their faces. In the reflection of the glass doors behind them, two figures stood evenly aligned against an illuminated horizon. She had not become powerful because he diminished her. She had always been powerful. The difference was visibility, structure, and choice. He had not lost power by respecting her. He had refined it. As the city's cheers rose faintly from below, swallowed by distance and wind, Imani lifted her chin toward the skyline that had once witnessed her silence and now reflected her sovereignty. Jonathan stood beside her without attempting to frame the view. In the architecture of their shared life, there were no longer rooms designed for one voice alone. There was space. There was structure. There was sustained, practiced respect. And beneath the vast, unblinking lights of Manhattan, that was more enduring than any spotlight.